This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. I'm your host, Mustache Chris, and on this journey, I will be joined by my co-host, Frank, and we are going to be tackling what I consider one of the greatest television series of all time, and what Frank considers the greatest season of television of all time, True Detective. To tackle this series, which runs at 8-hour-long episodes, we decided to devote 2 episodes per podcast. So buckle up, people, because this is going to be a long ride. I remember watching True Detective when it came out, and I was just blown away each week. I think one of the reasons I love the show so much because it gave me Twin Peaks vibes, which I think is the greatest television show of all time.
You know, one of the things that Twin Peaks and True Detective very much have in common is how they work their way into the zeitgeist of the, TV viewing public while they were running. I mean, I did not watch Twin Peaks, and I might try it and I might love it. You never know, but it's just never appealed to me. And honestly, David Lynch's films haven't either. So I think there's a better than average chance I wouldn't dig it. But not having watched it, I was still aware of, the Kyle MacLachlan agent, whatever his name was, the cherry pie, the small town, the murder, the who killed Laura, I mean, I knew all of these things about the show without never having watched the show because it got into our culture, so much in that time period. And I don't know if True Detective did that as much when it was going. I didn't watch it right away. I wasn't aware of it right away. I watched it after it was already, the season had already had its run, but before season 2 came out. But from what I've read, it had a pretty similar sort of, took up residence in the zeitgeist a bit.
Yeah, it was a pretty big cultural phenomenon because I remember going to work and working with, I work at an auto recycler. So typically they're not, this isn't the type of show that they would really watch most of the time. It's usually, comedies, that type of stuff, or sports. And I'd come into work and everyone was talking about the show, which I knew right off, if the people I'm working with are really talking about the show, then a lot of other people are really talking about the show every week. In particular, there was a hardcore atheist at my work that was particularly Rust Cole's character.
Oh yeah, I totally couldn't see that.
He thought he was so cool, and
he is cool.
He is cool, but we'll get into it a little bit. But one of the reasons I immediately jumped to the show too is that it just mixed a lot of stuff that I really enjoy. I enjoy detective stories, especially detective movies. I enjoy horror films, and there's definitely horror aspects throughout this entire show. I enjoy conspiracy theories. We're going to get into that in a little bit here. I'm not dismissive of conspiracy theories right off the bat, and we'll get into some. Me and Frank kind of disagree on this a little bit. We'll get into a little bit of the ones that are legit. They're documented. There's no disputing them, and there's no way that the writer didn't look at some of these cases when he was coming up with the conspiracy that is in season 1 of True Detective. That's a theme throughout each one of the seasons too, is that there's a different conspiracy, and it's usually a different type of conspiracy, where the second one is more organized crime / mixed with, government
corruption.
officials.
There's municipal corruption. Mm-hmm.
And the third season kind of tilts a little bit more back into the conspiracy that's in season 1. I think that was just because of a course correction, because people didn't really know what to take. I don't know. They didn't like the second season as much as the first, right? That's my opinion.
Yeah. No, they didn't. We'll talk about that actually, because we're talking about episode 1 and the overview of the series here. And in the final episode of this mini series, we'll talk about the last episode of season 1, and we'll talk about seasons 2, 3, and a little bit about season 4, which is coming out here. So, but all of this was the brainchild of Nick Pizzolatto. Let's tell people about Nick. What's his deal?
Well, Nick is, he was actually teaching at like a university, I believe it was the University of North Carolina. And he got inspired watching the change in television that happened with shows like The Wire, The Sopranos, and Deadwood, because
I forgot to mention Deadwood. Deadwood was awesome. That was a great show.
I think it's a little difficult for people to kind of understand nowadays because television has risen up so high in terms of its quality. But for a long time, television was known as like, that's where people who go and can't write or people who can't act go on television, right? Like movies was really what you wanted to do, right? Like that was the pinnacle, right? Shows like,
there's a hierarchy.
Yeah. Like not to talk about like Twin Peaks again, but in the sense like Twin Peaks really kind of started to change how people saw television, because all of a sudden, you had a guy like David Lynch was getting into episodic television and it became a big cultural phenomenon. And then there was shows kind of like the X-Files, which raised what people saw the potential for television, right? And then HBO started getting involved, and like I pointed out, did shows like The Sopranos and The Wire. Oz was a big one. Deadwood, that showed that television is just as legitimate as a film in terms of an art form, and in many ways it can be better because you're not constrained by 3 hours tops, right? Story,
yeah. The other thing is if you think about it, though, when prestige TV started, when prestige television started, where it really took off, it was HBO. It was those shows that you mentioned. And the reason I think that was the tip of the spear, not to take anything away from Twin Peaks because it had its role, but I have to go back and look at the timeline of what came out first. But what caused the deluge to break free and for people to start going, oh, TV is just as good as the movies, just a little different format is all, was the fact that, HBO was able to bridge the gap between movies and television in terms of length of episodes. I mean, Sopranos were true hour-long episodes most of the time. They weren't 43 minutes, 46 minutes. And content, and you could say things we don't say on this podcast on that show. You could show things that you would never be able to show on regular television. And then of course the way that they shot it, and that, they started making it with a higher production value. But if you go back even to shows like Miami Vice, Miami Vice was shot. Michael Mann shot that. I guess I don't know if he directed every episode, but the show was shot like a 1-hour movie every week. I mean, the shots that they set up, the cinematography of it, the set design and everything. And so it really kind of started. It had little moments back then, but what busted it wide open for everybody, I think, was the HBO onslaught of these shows. So it's very fitting that the show we're talking about was an HBO.
I'll mention though that Nick ended up picking, because he ended up getting the job for True Detective. He wrote a couple novels, and he made the pitch to HBO, right? And HBO was like, "We're interested," and he ended up writing the whole shabam, like the whole script, everything, which is very not common in television. Usually, if you look into television shows, there's like a team of writers that usually end up writing, even on miniseries, right? Where there's usually a couple of guys working on the script together, and it's like a collaborative effort. Where Nick ended up just writing the whole thing himself, which is, I thought, really helped the show in terms of having like a unified direction. Like, this is going to be the beginning, this is the end, and I'm the one overseeing this entire thing. I created this entire thing. And same thing with the director, actually, which they went through a couple of different choices for director, but they ended up going with Cary Fukunaga. Is that how we decided to pronounce it?
That's how I'd say it.
Yeah, they decided to go with him. And also, which really weird about it too is he directed every single episode in this series too. Very not common in television. Usually they'll hire a director and he'll work with the showrunner, the creator of the show, and those will be kind of the twin monsters that are responsible for overseeing the entire thing. And the director will usually direct the pilot episode. Might direct maybe one or two during the series and the finale, right? This is kind of what happened with Twin Peaks too, where David Lynch directed the very first episode, the pilot episode. I think he directed a couple during the first season. Second season, he wasn't involved as much, and I think that's why the quality of the show started to go down. But he ended up directing the very last episode too. It's weird that it's just different for television.
Different, yeah. But it provides that you mentioned before. It provides that unified vision, both creatively, both from the writer who knows why he had Rust say this in episode 1 and why Marty did that in episode 2, because there's payoff in episode 6 or 7, and the director being the same. Man, that just creates the way it's presented, everything about how it's presented, from the shots to the cuts to the, whether it's a close up or not, whether we're going to use, what kind of film stock it's going to look like, and all this kind of stuff, is consistent all the way through. And I think, when I was younger and I used to go to movies all the time, long before streaming, back when you would sit next to a dinosaur that would make a lot of noise when you're trying to watch the movie. I always liked it when I would see in the credits written and directed by, Mustache Chris. And so you'd be like, oh, okay, the guy that wrote this or the gal that wrote this also directed it. And so that there's going to be, it might suck, but it's going to suck in a very consistent way. And it might be great because their vision is going to be very on point. Because I'm always, as a writer, I'm in charge of what I write. And I write alone 99% of the time. And even when I collaborate with another author, I have a series that I collaborate with a friend of mine on, we're writing the same book, but at separate times, and it's going back and forth, and the same with the editing process. So there's collaboration there. But it's mostly a solitary thing. Even when you send your story or your book out to a beta reader to read and give feedback, it's still, I wrote it alone. I sent it out and waited. They did their beta read and their suggestions alone. They sent it back to me. I read those alone and decide what to incorporate alone. It's very solitary. And so when I talk to friends of mine who are in the entertainment business, I'm bowled over sometimes by how collaborative it is. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing, but it's a different approach. And when you have collaboration, you definitely have, two things occur. For one, you have to have a willingness to compromise, because you're not going to get your way. Your idea is not going to be the one that gets used every time, right? Whereas if you're writing a book by yourself, you decide. But the other thing that can occur is you get some, I don't want to call it dilution because it's not exactly what I mean, but you can get a little bit of vision drift, because it's more than one person. And sometimes that helps you happen upon a great idea or a great way to present something or whatever. And that's great. That's why it works. But the downside to it is that drift. And if you have the same writer and the same director the whole way through, you don't get that. So if it's a good vision and it's a talented writer and a talented director, then you're going to get something at least somewhat close to what was in their head when they created it. When Pizzolatto just created the story, when Fukunaga saw it before he shot it, you're getting on the screen something much more closely approximating that perfect vision than if it had been collaborative. And like I said, I'm astounded by how collaborative it is. When I talk to folks that I don't know if I could function in that environment. I think it would be too collaborative. But you're right to point out that this is a little bit of an outlier to have the same author same writer for all 8 episodes, and a single writer at that, and then the same director. And both of them, I think, did a spectacular job on this season.
Yeah, I'll just use like an example off the top of my head that could have probably benefited from this type of format. Maybe if The Walking Dead, had focused on one writer, one director each season, we would have had a more maybe the brilliance of the first couple of seasons could have continued on for a bit. I stopped watching it because I was like, I can't. I
did too, and I really enjoyed it for a while. So yeah, that's a good example. That's a good example of vision drift, and of course that's an adaptation of a comic, a graphic novel, and this was an original work. So when you have an adaptation, you're already gonna have some changes. Whereas at least in this case, you're adapting it from a screenplay to or teleplay, I guess, to a actual television production. It's only going through one iteration of change, unlike The Walking Dead, which is undergoing two, and then has a different person. That's just so weird to me, having a different person at the helm every episode. It's like, I mean, directors set so much set tone. Even if the writing is the same, even if the same writer for all 3 episodes and you had 3 different directors, the way they choose to shoot it, you see it in Game of Thrones. There's different episodes that have a different tone, even back when it was, outstanding TV before the last couple of seasons where there's a little bit of a drop off in the writing. You see different ways of shooting different kinds of scenes. And of course, the good thing about it is different directors have different strengths. I mean, if you look at, like, to use Game of Thrones, a guy like Miguel Sapochnik, I think is how you say his name. He directed the Battle of the Bastards. He directed, Hard Home, these big set piece battle episodes he was very good at. But maybe he wouldn't have been as good as some other director at directing these more intimate, dialogue heavy court shenanigans, court politics and so forth, power play politics and everything, or the emotional gut wrenching scenes that weren't, battle based. Maybe somebody like Art Taylor was better at that or something along those lines. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it definitely worked in favor of this series, that it was the same writer, same director all the way through. It was very tight. It was very singular. You never felt like it was meandering.
Yeah, well, I mean, true. I mean, Game of Thrones is the type of show that definitely would have benefited from having an ending already written. But maybe that's for a whole other podcast series. I guess we'll get into the casting. Like, I mean, for the most part, True Detective is a 2-man show. Like, there's a lot of side actors, but for the most part, throughout the entire series, and I have to rewatch every single episode, I don't think there's a moment where there's not either Rust or Marty on screen.
There are, but there are very few. I think we're safe to say that this is a spoiler podcast. So if you haven't seen True Detective yet, go. What are you doing here? Stop. Go watch it. But in the later episodes, like when we finally get to meet Errol Childress, there's a scene with him and his cousin or sister or whatever she is. I haven't rewatched that episode yet. So we do get to see just the two of them. And then there's the scenes where Maggie goes to the bar, like she's going to step out on Marty after he cheats the second time. Well, not the second time, but the second big event where she catches him. And so that there's another one where they're not on, but it's in the 90 percentile. The two of them are on there. I would argue that Maggie is kind of a third head, albeit, she's not as big a character, but she's an important character in this series, even though she doesn't have as much screen time as the two of them. But it is mostly not only about Rust and Marty, but their relationship is a central piece.
Well, okay, so Nick initially he was interested in Matthew McConaughey to be in the series based on his recent work and Killing Joe, and The Lincoln Lawyer. And I suggest to anyone with a strong stomach to watch strong stomach and impingement for The Perverse, to watch Killing Joe, because it is one of the craziest movies I've ever seen in my entire life. It's insane, but it's
in my queue, so I'll have to take that into consideration and maybe bumping it up the queue a bit.
Yeah, you can definitely see a bit of Russ and Matthew McConaughey's role in that movie. It's, like I said, it's not for everybody. It's really it's really perverse. It's really grimy. It's very I don't want to give it away. You have to have a strong stomach to watch it. And I'm not talking like, oh, like, I don't know, Faces of Death type stuff. I'm just like, it's grimy. It's down in the dirt. And initially he actually wanted, Nick actually wanted Matthew to play the role of Marty, and Matthew McConaughey he was interested in being involved in the series, but he wasn't interested in the role of Marty. Actually, he was much more interested in the role of Russ Cole, and he pushed and pushed and pushed for it, and he ended up getting the role. And he even went so far as writing a 450-page analysis of Russ Cole himself to try to get into the character's head. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, and I'm reading this, I'm like, I don't understand. Like, why is this not published with Matthew McConaughey like reading it? Because I would listen to this, because I think it's fascinating. Because I think the entire script was, I think it was 600 pages or something, or 700 pages for all 8 episodes. So this guy pretty much wrote in a parallel script, just trying to get into the head of this guy, which I just think is insane. And it's funny because when Matthew McConaughey first started as an actor, he was like, I don't know, he was like the lover boy. You know what I mean? He did like the girl movie.
He was the bimbo. He was the himbo.
Yeah, like the girls liked him, and I get it. You know, he's a good looking guy, and he's always been in really good shape, you know, and he's like ripped.
He was the guy that a lot of the wives that I knew would use to tease us husbands, you know, about being a dreamboat and everything, you know, and I didn't think much of him. I mean, I didn't think poorly of him. I didn't think highly of him. He was just another rom-com lead. That's all he really was in my mind. And boy, I mean, you know, he had his, what they call it, reconnaissance or whatever, where he started making these films that were different. The first time I saw him in anything different that I was like, this guy's a good actor, was in The Lincoln Lawyer. And I thought he did a good job in that. And then I think the next thing I saw him in was True Detective. So, I mean, everything else was just movies I was aware of that he was in, because I'm not a huge rom-com guy, you know. And so it's interesting to me how much he embraced this role and how much preparation he did. And I will say he thoroughly inhabits this character. I don't see Matthew McConaughey when I watch this show. And I'm on my for this podcast, I just watched episode 1 before we recorded this. And I've been planning to watch only the episodes we're going to talk about, you know, before each recording session. And so I think this is probably the 5th time I've seen the series. This go through will be the 5th or so. And I still don't see Matthew McConaughey when I watch it. I see Woody Harrelson a little bit when I see Marty Hart, but I see Russ Cole, because the character just disappears into the role so much, and that you don't see that as often as you would think. And not even from the same actor. I mean, there are other movies where I definitely see Matthew McConaughey, you know, he just happens to be doing a good job, but it's still Matthew McConaughey acting. Not here. And he just, like I said, he thoroughly inhabits the role. And that's part of what makes it work so well, because the way he presents the character is so believable and engrossing. I mean, you can't help but get drawn into the character because of how deeply he is drawn into the character to become the character. So it's interesting that they had him in mind for the other role. And I think it's a very good thing that he chose to push to be Rustin Cole instead of Martin Hart.
Well, I agree with you totally. I think part of the reason it helps too that you don't see Matthew McConaughey in the role is I believe he was coming off. I'm trying to remember that movie that he did where he played. I think he won an Oscar for it. Where was it Dallas Buyers or something like that? And he had to play.
I think you've got it backwards on the chronology here. Let me look real quick, but I'm pretty sure that came after. Yeah, it came a year later. Dallas Buyers Club was after this. Yeah. And I actually think he probably got that role based on being seen as a serious actor because of True Detective. I mean, it definitely sparked his, coupled with The Lincoln Lawyer, I think sparked his, this guy can do serious, like Tom Hanks, he had to do a couple serious roles and, he's not just a comedian,
His physical traits in this series. The reason I thought it was because he's like, my wife pointed it out when we were watching episode 1. I was like, he's really skinny.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And he's even skinnier in the movie that you're talking about. He gets even thinner.
Like, he's always, maybe he was in prep, I don't, because he's always been a guy on the thinner side. Like I said, he's always been in shape and like kind of ripped, but you could tell like he had some muscle mass on him. And this series, he's like really thin. And I think it helps you really get engrossed in like, this is just Rust and not Matthew McConaughey, because it's not that Rust is not a good looking guy or anything like that. He's just not as good looking as what we were talking about earlier when Matthew McConaughey was going through his rom-com phase, right?
And he's not shot that way either. And the way they have him cut his hair and everything, he's not presented as some kind of a sex symbol or whatever. He's shot much more like a regular looking guy, and he is very gaunt. And so he doesn't have that, beach bum look that, you saw in some of the Ghosts of Girlfriends Past or whatever, these kinds of movies that he was making. Moving on to Marty, that seems to me like perfect casting too. I mean, Woody Harrelson, plays the Louisiana cowboy jock to a T. I mean, he just fits it perfectly. I believe him 100%. I just can't not see Woody because Woody's Woody. But he definitely inhabits Martin Hart as well, and you can see it more. I think where it comes out more for me in how he plays Marty at different times in the different time periods. Like Rust is Rust all the way through. He changes a little bit in his appearance and everything, but he's still Rust. Like, Marty goes through some changes and some heartbreak and some growth. Much of his, what happens to him is obviously self-inflicted, but, I see less Woody in the 2012 version of the character than I do in the 1995 version of the character. And that's just, again, because of spending time with the character and the way that he develops and the way that Harrelson plays him. But he hits the mark perfectly, I think.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, and Woody Harrelson, he was interested in doing the show just because of some of the people that were involved in it and people that he was interested in working with. And Matthew McConaughey pushed for him to get the role. He's like, he's Marty, right? And, the rest is history.
And boy, he was too. There's no question.
And I guess we should talk about Maggie for a little bit, because she's the third of her character.
Yeah, just for a second anyway. I think that, she provides an interesting counterpoint to both of the other two characters. She's the grounded character who's trying to make a family work in the midst of all this obsession and all this madness that's going on. And she's the one in this first episode, when Rust finally makes it to, when we finally get to the dinner that's alluded to through much of the episode, she's the one whose empathy, toward Rust is what changes his mind about staying for dinner, and makes him more comfortable and makes him, realize that this, sitting through dinner with a woman and a little girl, which was so daunting and of a prospect for him that he had to get, as Marty said, had to get a load on before he came, maybe it wasn't going to be that bad. Maybe it would actually be a pleasant thing. And that's, why he decides to stay. That was all because of Maggie and, her calling Marty on his BS throughout the series, I think is important. Her representing, what Marty loses, is important. And plus I really like Michelle Monaghan. I think she's a fantastic actress. And, again, really does a great job sinking into this role. And even though she's cheated on, and even though she's, a lot of her purpose there is in service of Marty's arc and so forth, I still think she represents a stronger female presence. A character who's female and strong. I mean, she does leave him. She does make a life for herself. She does have the courage to still care about a person, even though they don't have that same relationship anymore. And, in a show where, let's face it, the female presence is very much in service of the male storytelling here. That's just the nature of that's not a judgment. That's just the nature of the show. The two leads are male leads, and it's seen mostly through their eyes, so it makes some sense. But she stands out and kind of as a counterpoint to that much of the time. Even when her character's a little bit of a punching bag emotionally, she punches back eventually, and that I think makes her a compelling character.
No, I just pointing out, you mentioned the dinner scene, and when Maggie and Russ first meet each other, and Russ is loaded, and she actually listens to what he has to say. That really hit home to me on a personal level, and we'll get into a little bit why I identify with Russ, and a lot in some ways, and obviously not in other ways. But in terms of his kind of innate, kind of depressive nature, but we're going to get into that a little bit. But that scene was very powerful, and the way she looks at Marty, being like, well, "How did you? You know what I mean? Like, how did you not?
How do you not know this? Yeah,
working with this guy, like, I don't understand." I mean, in Marty's defense, like, Russ was loaded, so he's probably naturally kind of going to open up a little bit more, but. I mean, Russ wasn't really, he didn't seem all that interested in trying. Marty didn't seem all that interested in trying.
No. And Russ showed in the car, which are some of the greatest scenes in this series and in this episode, the interactions between Russ and Marty in the car. He shows he's willing to answer questions. I mean, Marty gets more than he bargained for when he starts asking these questions. But, and you get the impression that maybe Rust wasn't offering anything up in the past. I mean, Marty says something to that effect, but you have to wonder how much of that was Marty not asking either. And so, I think that the personality of both Rust and Marty played into that lack of communication happening. And I think the personality of Maggie obviously played into Rust opening up to her. And the fact is that Rust's a very honest person. He's very honest and very, what you see is what you get throughout the entirety of certainly this first episode. And, so I don't think it occurred to him to not tell Maggie the truth about his wife and daughter, and, his daughter's death and his divorce. And the fact that she was willing to ask, and like you said, to listen, is what obviously made it work. And that's not what was working at the time between Rust and Marty. They barely listened to each other, All
right. So now that we kind of starting to talk about a bit about episode 1, why don't you give us a quick synopsis of episode 1 here, Frank?
Well, this takes place in Louisiana, and not New Orleans, but more, I would say, more rural Louisiana, kind of in the types of towns that, are trapping, what do they call them? I call them crawdads. What do they call them in Louisiana? Crawfish. And working, there you see the industrial, skeletons of industry all throughout these areas. So that's the setting, which I think you would agree that sets it apart too. The fact that it's in this different, Louisiana is a character unto itself for sure. Right?
I've said this before with Steve, and I've talked to many other Americans. I personally have never been to Louisiana, but I've read a lot about Louisiana and Louisiana history. I don't even really consider Louisiana part of the States. because it is just so different from everything else in the States. Like there's like, you know what I mean? Like there's, even within the state of Louisiana, like you go up to like northern Louisiana and then you're in southern Louisiana, the accents, it's almost like a different country.
It's our Quebec.
Yeah, that's the way I would describe it. It's like Quebec. And even how the government runs. Like if you look at, say, the history of Huey Long, Huey Long could only happen in a place like Louisiana. Like it couldn't have happened anywhere else in the United States because it is so different.
And you get introduced to this first episode, right away with the opening credits. You see a little bit of what this show is going to be like. I mean, you see those industrial shots. You see the shots that are religious in nature that obviously evoke a certain sense of religiosity. And then you and of course there's the silhouette of one of the two main characters in the background for all of these shots. And of course the iconic music that T-Bone Burnett and Nick Pizzolatto chose for this series. I mean, the opening song from the Handsome Family, I'm pretty sure that's the title of the band, is just perfect. It's so perfect for this show. And I don't know about you, like when I watch a series, like I'll watch the credits on the first episode, and then when I know it's either a season finale and there's nothing, I gotta wait, or it's the series finale, I'll watch the opening credits again for that. It's like a special treat. But other than that, I skip them. And I don't for True Detective. I watch the opening credits every time I watch every single episode, just because that's so great. And in season 2, they use a great song by Leonard Cohen called Nevermind. And the lyrical content, they use different parts of the song cut together differently in different episodes. And so it's worth watching the credits for that too. So that's our introduction to this show with 3 different timelines going on. 1995, 2003, I think, is the middle one. And 2012, detectives Hart and Cole are assigned to what appears to be a ritualistic killing next to a tree in the middle of a cane field. And they start their investigation. And right away, we get this strong sense of who these two men are. And what they are is polar opposites. I'm talking philosophically, their life circumstances, their personality, their morality, their skill sets as an investigator, just to point out a few differences. So we also learned that in the present, which is 2012 for this story, 2 other detectives are investigating a similar case to that 1995 case that Hart and Cole catch in the first scenes. They're interviewing both men in 2012, and so we're getting most of this story via flashback. So the POV cuts from the present to 95, and it jumps around within the 95 scenes, which is a storytelling mechanism that really works because it resembles the way someone might relate events in an interview. Rather than just, a straightforward chronological story like we're used to. So in this episode, Hart and Cole, they work together and separately to move the case forward. They do discover, just because of fingerprints, the identity of the victim, and they proceed to investigate the case and bring other people in to assist. And they are just very distinctly aware of the machinations that are taking place around them, both within the department and state politics that are coming into play. And meanwhile, we get the very strong inkling. I mean, you don't have to be paying much attention to get this, that the present day detectives might suspect Cole in this 2012 murder that has just occurred. And that kind of comes out very blatantly in the final scene of the episode. And Cole doesn't exactly acknowledge it, but he kind of faces it a little bit without saying speaking directly to it. And it's got a great line at the end of the first episode here where he tells them they need to start asking the right questions if they want to know the answers to what they're looking for. I can't repeat the line exactly what he said because of the PG rating on this podcast, but it's a great line. It's very well delivered, and it's a great ending to the episode. So a lot of the episode is about, setting up what the murder was, setting up how they're going to attack the investigation, and learning about Rust and Marty and who they are and what their relationship is and where they are in life. But also there's a whole ton of little strands, little breadcrumbs that are thrown down that you're going to be following in future episodes. I mean, there's references to a falling out that they had in 2003. What was that about? There's a couple different references to Marty and Rust rescuing some kids. And they don't really get into any details, but they both reference it in their interviews. And so if you haven't seen the show before, there's these tantalizing bits of information that you want to, that you're looking forward to finding out where they lead. And if you have seen the series before, it's a great reminder of what's to come. So that's kind of the summary, I guess, loose summary of the first episode. We get to see how Rust and Marty interact, and they're definitely two very different people. And we learn, that Rust lost his daughter, and then his marriage fell apart after that, and he became a pessimist philosophically. We get a hint that Marty might be fooling around on his wife by the way he interacts with a court reporter that comes into the office. I don't know what other details from the first episode should people know if for some reason they're listening to this podcast not having seen the first episode.
No, I'd say that sums up episode 1 right off the bat. Like I said, we get introduced to Russ and Marty. They're polar opposites. There's murder that's taken place that has occult overtones. Russ says right off the bat, like, this isn't just like a murder, right? Like, this has scope, this has vision, I think those are quite literally the words that he uses.
Purpose.
And there's something bigger going on here. And there's obviously been other murders that we have to look into, that are similar. So yeah, no, that introduces episode 1 pretty much, which I guess I can kind of segue to, as you mentioned, I mentioned the occult stuff. And I don't think there's really a way for the writer, Nick, must have really kind of delved deep into some of the stuff that happened with the satanic panic, that was in the 80s. Now, right off the bat, me and Frank were going back and forth with this, but I mean, right off the bat, there is a lot of BS with the satanic panic stuff, right? There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. A lot of it was sensationalized stuff that was most of it was put on daytime television, right? To basically get the evangelical types glued to the television. Not just them, but it just in general, like just
ratings,
people,
baby, ratings,
right? But like, I'll point out some that I don't think are really indisputable. Like, if you look at, say, and you don't have to be like an Alex Jones type to really look into these things, right? Like tinfoil hat or a religious nutcase or anything like that. I think my religious beliefs have come out on this show a couple of times, right? I'm not. Frank's talked to me enough times. He knows I'm not religious, like Bible thumping nutcase. I go to church and I read my Bible and I believe in God. But if you look at the case of Johnny Gosch, which is maybe people might be most familiar with that case. He was the kid that was on the milk carton, right? And his wife and her husband, after their son went missing, they pushed very hard for stranger danger. I'm sure people have heard of that saying. And if you look into his case, now I'm not saying that there's just so much weird stuff with his case that you can't, like, I'm not going to get into all the details. I suggest people go look into it. And I think actually you will have a greater appreciation for the season of True Detective. Just look into his case. It's very dark. It's very, it's like if that type of stuff bothers you, then don't do it. But there's just so much. I'm not saying it's all true, but there's just so much weird stuff related to that case that simply just cannot be like just explained away to be like, oh, this is just a bunch of people going, like acting crazy, right? That there's now, could you build a court case on it? Probably not. But yeah, I think you can walk away from it and go, yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff with that, And there's like other examples too. Maury Terry, who was a journalist, he wrote a book called The Ultimate Evil. And there's actually a mini series on Netflix right now called The Son of Sam's that's about it. And he was an investigative journalist during the David Berkowitz murders, right? And he was one of the guys that really pushed hard that there's no way that David Berkowitz did this by himself. And he wrote a whole book. Some of it, the information is not entirely accurate now that more evidence has come forward. But there's a lot of stuff that he ends up investigating in that book, The Ultimate Evil. And they touch on a fair amount of it in that mini series, The Sons of Sam. I don't think there's any rational person who can really walk away from reading that book and go, no, there's definitely a lot more going on with this. Because the son of Sam, David Berkowitz, he almost immediately said that like he was influenced by like a satanic cult, the devil, like almost right off the bat. And right off the bat, he said he wasn't working by himself. No, I can't say with 100% certainty if that was the case. I've read the book, I've watched the miniseries, I've done other research, and there was definitely a lot of weird stuff going on with that case in particular. There's another, there's another example with the Finders cult, which I think people started talking a little bit more about, in particular, especially when the Jeffrey Epstein stuff was happening. If you look at the Finders cult, which was basically, it was like a cult that was ran by the CIA. And it's so bizarre. It is so weird. Just the type of, once you kind of divulge into the history of it, you can't walk away and go like, well, I mean, there's definitely something weird going on here. And it was definitely a cult. And there was definitely occult themes to it. And then I guess I'll use like one more example. If people kind of look into something called the Franklin Credit Union scandal, and actually the third season, I think, of True Detective was much more inspired by this scandal, but there's aspects of it in True Detective season 1. And there's in particular 2 books that an author named Nick Bryant wrote, and it was called the Franklin Scandal. And the actual lawyer that was involved in the case, John DeCamp, he wrote a book about the Franklin scandal too. And I suggest anybody read those 2 books. There's a couple podcasts and documentaries and stuff about it too. And there's just a lot of really bizarre stuff went on with that. Really bizarre, where you go, I mean, all these kids can't be lying. There's no way that they're all lying. Maybe some of them are lying, but there's no way that they're all lying. And that was one of the things that kind of really grabbed me right off the bat was the fact that they were willing to kind of go down this occult murder route. And I don't know how you feel about any of that stuff, Frank, but I suggest some of the stuff that I just listed there, I suggest to the audience to kind of look into themselves and read and come to your own conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a country of 300 million people. And so are there crazy people out there who are influenced by evil, what people call evil, i.e. Satanism or satanic overtones or whatever? Absolutely. Are there groups that have elements of that, cults that have elements of that woven into their philosophy or their mission statement or whatever? Absolutely. Sure. And do they do horrible things that are very real? Yes, that occurs. And I'd never try to gainsay that. But, I think it's pretty QAnon to think that there's this overarching, right hand of Satan corporation that's running all of it. That's where I get off the train and don't believe in that level of conspiracy by any means. But it doesn't take that for, and of course, saying evil, that's a very subjective term to use, right? But I think people have a pretty good idea what I mean when I say it. It doesn't require that level of coordination for evil to occur. I mean, history has shown us that, 3 people together can create a cult that can bring out a lot of evil deeds, or 2 people or 1 even. And when we're talking about inflicting, pain and even death on innocent victims, that's a pretty evil thing. I mean, we're not going to talk about the episodes that follow this time out, but obviously we get to a couple of them. When we get to a couple of them, you're going to see some very evil deeds having taken place and some pretty heartbreaking ones. And so, I mean, like I said, before I was Frank the crime writer, I was Frank the cop, and I saw evil occasionally. Mostly I saw human weakness and human failure and bad judgment, and mistakes. But occasionally you do see what I would call, evil. And that's coming from a guy who is, probably atheist, likely, agnostic at best, and who has a lot of bad feelings about religion as an organized entity. And I don't have all the answers of the universe. So, when you say, does evil exist? Well, I don't know if it exists as an entity unto itself, but certainly evil deeds exist. Evil intent exists within some humans. And the reason people are so fascinated by it, I think, is because it isn't as common as maybe we sometimes think. It is an uncommon thing, and therefore the subject of fascination. And when we're talking about what Rust and Marty are doing here, they are faced with someone who has committed an evil deed, who is an evil person. I think, no question. And whether they're acting alone or in concert with a small group or a large organized group, a huge, conspiracy. Well, we don't know that at this stage of the story. We don't even know that it's a possibility, really. I mean, the only hint at that is when they bring the Reverend Tuttle through and they start talking about task forces, more than one task force, to try to address it. Whether or not it's a concerted effort of a lot of people, a few people, or just one, people can and do perform evil. And so it's real in its results. And that's what Marty and Rust are dealing with. And it's encapsulated, I think, in one of the best lines of the entire series. And it's not from this episode, so flash forward a tiny bit, but it's where Marty is struggling with his infidelity. And I think he's mostly struggling with it because he's on the verge of getting caught. But either way, he asks Rust, do you ever wonder if you're a bad man? And Rust says no. And then he tells Marty, the world needs bad men. We keep the other bad men from the door. And I really like that quote because, they are somewhat engaging in evil acts for the purposes of good, but they're engaging in some evil acts themselves, for the greater good of dealing with people who are doing greater evil acts. And so it's an interesting piece there as well.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Well, I guess to maybe lighten the tone a little bit, even though this is not a light series at all. I mean, I always think this is fun when I talk about the show True Detective. It's like, I always ask people, who do you think you're more like Marty or Rust? And I personally, everyone thinks that they identify with Rust more because it's he's in a lot of ways, he's a much more interesting character. But I truly do believe I identify with Russ much more on a personal level. You look at the way that Russ kind of looks at humanity as being a mistake in the evolutionary process. For a long time, I did truly believe that. I did truly believe that human consciousness and human self-awareness was a mistake. And it's probably one of the most famous scenes in the in the series is in that car scene where Marty finally asks Russ, what's your deal, right? And he lays out his doctrine of pessimism. It's not his doctrine. He actually kind of gets it from pessimism as a philosophical idea has been around for forever. But when we typically talk about it, it's people associate with Arthur Schopenhauer, who was a German philosopher, and especially in his book, Will as Representation. And give me 2 seconds here, because I actually have it, the title of the book, where I've read it. It's not an easy read. The World as Will and Representation. It came out in 1888. And it's basically this kind of belief that really at the end of the day, life doesn't have much meaning, if any meaning. We have to create our own meaning to life, if there is to be any meaning. And there was another author that actually caught into this. And I believe the book sales actually went up after True Detective came out. There was another author named Thomas Ligotti. He wrote a book called The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, which lays out pretty much every major tenet of philosophical pessimism and gives us like a brief overview for each philosopher that kind of contributed to this. And one of the beliefs in philosophical pessimism is an extreme antinatalism. Now, if people are not familiar with the term antinatalism, it means anti-birth, like anti-producing children. And Russ talks about this, where he believed that because of human consciousness, because of human self-awareness, because we have the capacity of being able to think of things like, oh, good and evil, and this is right, and injustice, and art, and all the things that human beings typically concern themselves with, and in particular their own death. He looks at nature and he goes, well, there's no other animal that has ever existed in all of nature that is aware of this. We can't point to any throughout the entire existence of life on this planet, to the animals that we see now or the animals that lived before. He comes to the conclusion that all of this was a mistake, and it's a horrific mistake of nature. It's a cruel joke. And he straight up says that human beings should just either stop reproducing and we all just kind of slowly die off as a species, and nature just kind of corrects this mistake that it made. And that actually producing children is an evil act. It's selfish. It's a selfish act to produce children, because why would you bestow this curse on them too and continue this like horrific project, this horrific mistake? And for a long time, straight up, I actually did truly believe this. For a big chunk of my teenagehood and a big chunk of my young adult life. It's an interesting argument in the sense of, are people kind of genetically disposed to this type of pessimism, or is it something that you kind of gain in life from going through tragic incidences? I can say personally, after the passing of my father, that this extreme kind of depressive nihilism, pessimism, whatever word you would like to use, started coming into my worldview, because I've always been the type of person that takes an idea and takes it very seriously, will go to the conclusion with said idea and actually live it, right? And you look at Russ, and obviously the tragic incident that happened with his wife, with his daughter, and then the failure of his marriage afterwards to deal with that problem. I think Russ had a depressive nature just right from the get-go. And then after that incident, this extreme kind of pessimism crept in more so. I suggest to everybody to seek help immediately. And being dead serious when I say this, that if you catch yourself starting to think like this, because it is not a good way to live your life at all. Wasted many years of my life thinking like this and truly believing it. to the core of my being. But it's ironic because, not ironic, it's interesting because for the most part, it's not that I stopped caring about other people. I still cared about other people. I just found it very hard to believe that there was any kind of that there was any real meaning to life. It was just stuff happens to some people and stuff doesn't happen to other people. And it's all random. And the best way to go about it is let's just kind of end this horrific joke that we call life, you know? And maybe Russ talks about it himself. Marty calls him out on his BS and says, well, how come you're still around? And Russ says, you know what? I just, for lack of a better word, I'm too much of a wimp to end it myself, and because of my programming. And maybe that was, thankfully was the case with myself. There's other aspects of Russ that I don't really identify with, like his penchant for like kind of extreme violence and that type of stuff about Russ's character. But in terms of his philosophical outlook and his pessimistic nature and his penchant for extreme nihilism, I did truly believe that for a big chunk of my life. And we find that Russ grows as a character as the series goes on, in particular the last episode, which and some people didn't like, but I really liked myself. But yeah, there's my 15-minute spiel about how I really identify with the character of Russ Cole.
Well, I'm glad you got through what you got through to get to the other side on that. I'm sorry you went through that. That's a tough time. I think it's funny because everybody wants to say, oh yeah, I identify with Rust because Rust is the cool character, right? And he is like when The Wire was out, everybody's like, I'm Omar, and then they found out Omar was gay and suddenly like, well, I'm like Omar, but I'm not gay, or whatever. But, I kind of think the whole philosophy that he has, is viewed kind of negatively, like, there's no purpose to life. Why are we here? We should stop reproducing, all that. But there's an optimistic take on that too, is that if that's true, if there is no purpose, if we're a cosmic mistake as a species and we should have never been self-aware and so, and there's no plan and everything just happens. I mean, there's a great line in Rick and Morty where Marty's comforting his sister and he just says like, everyone dies. There's no purpose to anything. Come watch TV with me, or something like that. It's a pretty great line. And there's a lot of philosophy packed into that, little line on a cartoon, right? An adult cartoon. But there's some optimism that you can take from this, because if there is no true purpose, if there's no overarching purpose, if we just are, well, then it's a blank slate to be whatever you want and to love whoever you want and to discover the joy of living, however you choose. And so, your nature can embrace this philosophy, however it cares to, and so I don't think most people take it that way, but as someone who identifies with a lot of the things that Rust says, I try to take the positive from that because, just because there's no grand purpose doesn't mean I can't have a purpose, right? But everybody thinks, has a problem with that idea that there's, no overarching plan. I mean, that's why conspiracy theories are so popular. I mean, if you just look at something like Kennedy's assassination, all of the evidence, and people are going to get mad about this when I say this, but it's true. All of the best evidence points to Lee Harvey Oswald shot John F. Kennedy. He acted alone. That's the evidence. And are there strange things going on? Are there things people can point to, incongruities, mistakes, all this other suspicious stuff? Sure. But it doesn't change the overwhelming evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. It's not sexy. It's not exciting. And it really bothers people because there's this nobody basically who was able to take down this great man, right? And whether you think Kennedy was a great man as an individual, or you just want to recognize that the position he was in was one of great power. Either way, there's an imbalance there, and people seek to impose or reestablish some sort of balance by saying, well, it wasn't just Oswald. It was, pick your conspiracy. There's 15 or 20 of them that are pretty popular. And so I guess the point I'm making is that that's the people have that same problem with this idea that Rust is talking about. Like they don't like the idea that there's no God, or that there's no grand plan, or that there's no specific purpose to our existence other than to exist. And it makes them uncomfortable.
Well, I also think a lot of people too, they'll identify with Russ and be like, oh, like he's cool and dark and he's all these things. And I'm in terms of like philosophical pessimism, or taking like nihilism really to like its logical conclusion. Most people will not take the time and effort to really do these types of things where they actually sit down and really think, in silence, and read the books and really like come to these conclusions. If you guys haven't noticed, I read a lot, not fiction to Frank's chagrin, but I read a lot of nonfiction, and I take ideas very seriously. So I don't understand how somebody could look at Russ. Really, it's really difficult for me to go like, oh, that's like, he's like really cool. And then the conclusion I reach, and most of the time when I really do talk to people, they really haven't taken the idea very seriously. And I'm like, like you look at Russ, and it's the dude's suicidal. Like he's not like, he's cool in the sense of like, yeah, somebody to kind of observe from a distance, and he's cool that he's such a cool detective. He's such a good detective.
Well, Chris, a lot of our favorite characters are characters we love in fiction that we would hate if we were really they were really around. Like, they would annoy the hell out of us. You look at like the Big Bang Theory. Everybody loved Sheldon Cooper's character. He was fun and he was funny. But boy, if you lived with Sheldon Cooper, that, poor Leonard, right? That would drive you nuts. And it's the same with a lot of dramatic characters where you're like, yeah, that is a cool character. But in real life, you'd be like, I hate that guy. Keep him away from me. So I think people are they're making the mistake of thinking they identify with a character sometimes, when in reality, they just think he's a cool character. And I think that Rust is a very cool character. And there may be elements of Rust that we, that are part of our internal self, like we see ourselves or want to see ourselves in that fashion. Maybe not on the nihilism, but on some other aspects of his character. Certainly his single-mindedness and his dedication and his tenacity are admirable. And most of us don't have that level of focus or obsession if you really want to get down to it. But we can admire it, and we can think, our internal self identifies with that. But if you went and asked people, like the majority of people, if you went and asked someone else, are they more like Rust or Marty? It's going to be 95% Martys out there, I think. People are going to be, and because our external self is, who we present to others and how they see us. And it's very incongruent with our internal self. That's just a, reality of life for most people, except for somebody like Rust. Rust is very congruent in that regard, like who he is internally and who he shows to the world and how the world sees him. Those lines are almost parallel, those three. So, I don't see myself as either character, to answer your original question. I think I admire Rust as a detective. I admire Marty. And then we're going to talk in a second about, partnerships and everything. And I admire Marty for what he brings to the table. But part of the, beauty of this show is the contrasting nature of these two characters and the Venn diagram of where they intersect too.
Yeah, I guess there's one more thing on Russ and his pessimism. Or you mentioned most people probably wouldn't want to be around Russ. I actually wouldn't mind being around Russ, like having conversations with him, just because he is a remarkably intelligent person.
He probably likes Twin Peaks.
Probably. He's a remarkably intelligent person who's obviously put a lot of thought into the way he looks at the world. in a lot of ways I can identify with it. I mean, even within, you brought up like kind of a religious outlook. I mean, you can look at, I suggest anybody to read the book of Ecclesiastes, and that's basically like the entire book is laying out like Russ's worldview. Like the opening line is, the vanity of vanities, all is vanity. There's pessimism in the Bible. A lot of people don't know that. And like I had mentioned earlier, like this has always been around. It's like, well, whenever Ecclesiastes was written, it was written a long time ago. It's in there, right? And like over to the point, just a little tangent, like church history or what have you. People like looked at the book of Ecclesiastes and they're like, I'm not quite sure where to fit this in the entire, but it's honestly one of my favorite books. I think the other reason I really like Russ is because Russ is honest. There's no BS with Russ. He'll tell you that straight up. He's not going to sit there and start a conversation with you, right? You have to go start a conversation with him. But once you guys are talking, Russ isn't going to lie to you. He's going to tell you exactly how he feels about a particular circumstance or whether you're screwing up. And that level of honesty that you see in Russ, you just do not see that very often, even in real life.
And you mentioned vanity, and vanity is not a deadly sin that Rust has. I mean, in that conversation in the car, when Marty calls him out, like, why don't you just kill yourself, as you brought up earlier, he doesn't shy away from being critical of himself. He flat out says, it's my programming. I lack the constitution to end it. I mean, he's critical of himself with the same blunt honesty that he is of the world. And that, again, that's a rare trait.
Yeah, for sure. But I guess we should continue on to the nature of police partnerships, right? And you can speak much more about this, where I guess maybe some of the more philosophical stuff I can speak much more about, and more of the meat and bones police partnerships. You can speak with a lot more experience, considering you did it for a living.
Well, one quick thing on the car scenes, which are some of the most iconic of the series, and have some great lines. And I love it when he says, it means I'm not great at parties. And Marty says, yeah, I got news for you. You're not so great out of the parties either. It's a great line. But there's a great skit, a funny skit that Pete Holmes does. And I don't know what the skit is called, but if you put like True Detective Pete Holmes skit, into YouTube, it'll come up. And it's a parody of these scenes in the car. And they start out with like directly quoting the show. And then it just gets ridiculous after that, where he starts like, the Marty character is like, come on, there's got to be something in this world that you like. And he starts saying stuff, and Martin Russ just tears it apart. Everything he says and suggests, he tears it apart. I mean, like he hates puppies, and it's like, it's pretty hilarious. It's pretty funny. It's really well done. Pete Holmes does a great job. It's funnier than hell. But yeah, I mean, police partnerships, what makes a good partnership, right? I mean, it's somewhat the same as any type of partnership, a marriage or good friendship or whatever, except it's task specific, right? I mean, their partnership is formed to accomplish something. It's not like marriage is a partnership, in and of itself. It's for the purpose of partnering, whereas a police partnership is for the purpose of doing police work. It's directed, it's task specific. So a good partnership, you've got similarities, there's an intersection of skills and overarching purpose, but there have to be differences as well. And those differences tend to exist around corresponding strengths and weaknesses. So Rust is analytical. He's knowledgeable. He's well-read. He thinks outside the box. He is concerned with only the truth and not anything revolving, social etiquette or people's feelings. I mean, there's a shirt that's been going around recent years, that says, F your feelings, screw your feelings, to paraphrase. And while I think that's harsh, I kind of land on both sides of that argument, right? I think that's harsh, but I understand the sentiment behind it. Rust was the probably the first guy to, he probably created that t-shirt and marketed it. You know, I mean, he doesn't care about how you feel. He cares about the truth. He's nonconformist, you know, not for the purpose of being nonconformist, but because he doesn't care to conform. And he's uber focused. Like, he is so focused on his job. Marty, on the other hand, you know, he's good with people. He's very aware of social dynamics and what's proper to do and say in social situations. And he absolutely conforms to the norms of society, at least on the surface. Now, the two of them, though, they have this common foundation of police investigative knowledge, but their areas of excellence and focus differ. And you know, therefore they're complementary. So, like, if you notice, Marty most often is the one who conducts the interviews. You know, when you see him go to these different places, he's the one who usually starts the conversation and keeps it flowing. And if Rust interjects, it's a occasional pointed question, a follow-up question or something. He's not the lead interviewer. And that's because Marty has the greater social skills, and Rust recognizes that. So instead, you know, Rust observes and, like I said, maybe asks that pointed question occasionally, and he searches the surroundings. He looks around. He's inquisitive. And you can see a really good example of this at both. Honestly, you can see this take place in every interview. When they go interview the guy with cerebral palsy or whatever it was, at the Parthenon house is a great example of that. Marty gets information, but Rust is the one who finds the little spooky stick, devil trap thing out in the backyard, because he's, you know, playing to his strengths. But you notice, and especially later in the season, that when it comes time to interrogate, so when you're interviewing someone that's a compliant person who wants to give you information, and your skill is drawing out of them what it is that they may not know they know, even, or getting all the information from that they're more than willing to share, or they're not actively trying to lie to you anyway. An interrogation is a hostile subject, somebody who is resistive and does not want to share the information. That's the distinction between the two. And Rust takes the lead in almost every interrogation throughout the show. His skill set is far more honed in that department. And you also notice it's Marty who, throughout this entire season, and even in this first episode, he protects Rust and their partnership. And then by extension, the case, by keeping the case alive, at least as the two of them working on it. It's Rust's efforts overall, his late nights and his outside the box thinking and everything that solves the 1995 portion of the case anyway. But he would never have been able to do that if Marty hadn't have provided air cover for him with the bosses, you know, and Marty was able to do that because of his social skills and because of his interaction with the bosses and his ability to navigate the way things are done and how people respond and so forth. And so these two different skill sets definitely complement each other. I mean, Marty was able to shield him. And it wasn't just that he was running interference, though. He was also a good enough detective and had enough respect from others for his detective capabilities that when he saw Rust was onto something, that Rust was right, and then he threw his weight behind it, that kept the momentum going. So again, these are all complementary skills that I'm laying down now, and I want people to keep these in mind as the timeline in the series continues, especially when we get to 2012 and how, you know, what position are they in then? You know, Marty's a legit PI, while Rust is, you know, a rogue investigator, and yet Rust does things that Marty never would have been able to do, and Marty has access and methodologies that Rust doesn't because of how he investigates. And so they have these two different approaches. Now, on a personality side of things, the two of them obviously clash a lot, and they don't get each other, and yet. There's this push-pull between them, like that they don't really get along, and yet they kind of need each other in terms of their skill set. So I mean, ideally, a good partnership, you'd be friends too, or be able to be friends too, obviously. But when it's a task-oriented partnership like this is, that's not necessarily required. So those are just some insights on police partnership and how they manifest in this series.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
I think the scene in the first episode that really kind of sums up what you're talking about is Russ is carrying around his big ledger, and that's where he gets the nickname the Tax Man. He's carrying around the big book, and he's like meticulously drawing like the murder scene. He's taking all these details, and he starts coming to conclusions about the case almost immediately. And Marty goes to him, you ever thought about, you've already come up with the answer and you're taking evidence to fit that conclusion. And that kind of sums up their relationship, really, where Marty is constantly having to not hold Russ back, but, like, stop and think here for a minute, Russ. Like, I know you're a really smart guy, but you're not taking everything into account, right? And you pointed out, like, Russ, because of Russ' honesty, it leads him
people
to
don't like him.
People don't like him, right? And it leads him to having problems with authority.
Yeah, people in the show react to Rust the way we would react to Rust in real life, but we don't like it as the viewer because we like Rust as the viewer, right? So it's an interesting dynamic there. But you're right, Marty does. That's a good thing that partnerships will do, is they'll check and balance each other, and that's what he's doing there. Is he's just providing some check and balance, making sure we don't try to decide we already know the answer and bend every piece of evidence to fit the narrative. And that's a very, very, that tunnel vision is a very real danger that detectives face. So that's an excellent pull.
Detectives, and even like philosophically, if you're seriously thinking about philosophical ideas, you can get tunnel vision too, where you've already decided the conclusion that you want to reach.
And I think someone like Rust, he's got a pretty good handle on that, and Marty doesn't entirely. And there's another difference between the two, and why they make such a compelling partnership. And ultimately, they become friends, or even arguably family. Spoiler alert. But in the first episode, we have guys that have been together for 3 months, and Maggie is able to get more pertinent information out of Rust in a 1-minute conversation at dinner than Marty has in 3 months of working together. And so that tells us something about their personality as well.
Yeah. So I guess we'll just, finish wrapping up talking about like our favorite scenes, first episode. I mean, I guess I can kick it off. One of my favorite scenes, and this is like a small little scene, but so they're investigating, I don't know, they're like in some like deindustrialized area in Louisiana, and Russ, Marty's talking to him, and like Russ is like, "Oh, I don't sleep," right? Because you find out later that like he suffers from insomnia, right? Which is understandable. Like, look at the way this guy views the world. Look at the way he acts, and then like he says he has one line where he was like, "Oh no, I just dream." And then it's Russ, like Marty's just like, what are you even talking about? Then there's like a moment there where it's just a bit of humor. And it's like, is Russ just screwing around with Marty at this point? He's just like saying stuff. But I think
but Marty's expression is not humorous at all. He's pissed. Like he's like irritated to know. He's like, "Oh, you're kidding me. This guy." Yeah, that's a great moment. That's a great moment.
I've done like similar things with people where like I'm just like talking, and I'm very good at keeping like not showing expression when I'm telling a joke, very deadpan. And like I've done jokes like that where just like, I think I've actually literally used that one where I'm like, "Oh yeah, I don't sleep, just dream." People just didn't know. People don't know what to say. It's like, what is this guy even talking about at this point? I just thought it was brilliant because it adds a little bit of humor to that first episode where, well, just as a series, there's humor throughout this series. It just like it's
all the time in the car. All the time in the car has humor interlaced throughout. I mean, you're not good outside of parties. Let's make the car a place for silent reflection. I think we can safely say that their interactions while driving Like you could just, that's a favorite scene, even though it's more than one scene. And you alluded to one of my favorite scenes too. And again, it's a small scene, but I think it's pretty impactful. And that is the scene at dinner between Rust and Maggie where they're talking. I think that's a great scene. And then there's a series of really good, really neat little moments that Pizzolatto and Fukunaga really highlight. And that is, we just talked a few minutes ago about the police partnerships and different approaches. They show these different approaches, like even if just take the first scene. What does Russ do? He gets out his notepad and he draws a sketch of what he's seeing, and he's his approach is very analytical and so forth. But what does Marty do? Marty's doing all of the by the book stuff. He's getting the crime scene taped off. He's getting, a grid search set up. He's calling in for assistance. He's taking a picture. He's laying out placards, evidence numbering placards and things like this. And this is the case, when they're canvassing. This is the case when they're at the office. You see their different approaches. And so, I know it's not a favorite scene, but it's a bunch of small moments that are just really well done.
Yeah. And then in the dreamlike quality in some of the scenes, right, is something I particularly enjoyed, like the absolute bizarre, it feels like it's out of a dream, that murder scene, right? With the circle on the lady's back and the antlers and the way she's posed, that she's praying basically. It very much reminded me a lot of stuff that David Lynch has done, who I'm a big fan of. Yeah,
you don't know where it's going to go at this point. You don't know how fantastical, how Lovecraftian, or how occultist it's going to be. Like before we went on mic, you were saying that you could argue this is a horror in a crime setting, and at least it came out that way. And a lot of people, when it was happening live, when I've gone back and looked at the discussions, that's how they saw it. Like this is going to get otherworldly, and you never know until it's over whether it will or not. So,
like my first run through the show, yeah, we had discussed about it. I thought for sure I was waiting for some kind of supernatural element to be involved in the show. Because they hint to it, which is, I don't want to get too deep into all the other episodes, which I actually thought was pretty brilliant. They kind of hint to that maybe there's something else going on here, right? And to keep the audience on edge, right? Because that was one of the things in my initial run through this series. I was like, well, all right, are they going to do it? Are they not going to do it? I'll be happy either way, but there's a part of me feels like they're gonna go Twin Peaks with this or something. And
the thing about this show that we've been talking for close to 2 hours about a 1 hour episode, but the reality is there's a rule in storytelling, whether you're talking on the screen or on the page, and it's a very simple rule that any writer knows, and it's show, don't tell. And so how well you do that somewhat dictates how good the storytelling is going to be. And there is so little telling that takes place in this. There is all showing. It is just chock full of showing. And it's surface level showing, and then it's some nuance. Just look at the scene where the court reporter shows up to talk to Marty. You can pick up on the awkwardness of it. You can pick up on what's going on, and any watcher who's paying attention, who is an adult and understands how adults act, is going to go, oh, he's fooling around with that girl on the side, or something's going on there for sure. But then it turns the camera. If you notice at the end, the shot where he goes into the room for privacy to go over the transcripts or whatever, it's shot from behind. It's a profile shot, but it's shot behind Rust's desk. So you see Rust in profile as Marty and what's Alexander Daddario's character's name? I can't remember off the top of my head. As they go into the conference room, and you can see Rust. There's two things going on there. I think you see Rust. He is ignoring it. Like it's not his business. So he's ignoring it. But you can also guess that he knows what's going on there, just like we know what's going on there. And so that tells us something about the culture of that police department and what's going on there in terms of, what's acceptable and what isn't. I mean, there's references to the detectives hanging out at the bars, while they're out canvassing for Rust and Marty. I mean, it's not even a reference. It's flat out stated. So, I mean, there's definitely, some, I wouldn't call it corruption exactly, but it's not a straight laced department. And it's it's the state police, but they're not as straight laced as you might expect a state police agency to be. And so drinking on the job, philandering, these things are obviously kind of looked the other way as long as they don't explode in the public eye. And we get a little piece. So, we don't get told that. We don't see a bunch of guys standing around talking about, just got back from the bar. Oh, yeah, really? I just got back from my girlfriend's house, Yeah, we cops do that all the time here in Louisiana. That's a very blatant version of telling, right? But a lot of shows will do that. And ultimately we see Marty's infidelity, right? But our first time of getting anything to do with it is this more, slightly more subtle showing of what's going on. And Pizzolatto and the way that the way he wrote it and the way that Fukunaga directs it, it's all show. It is all show, and that is masterful. And so that's why, we have a section on the outline that just says moments of excellence in this episode. And I just kind of quit after like 4 because it's basically the entire episode and it's basically the entire series. And I know that sounds like a couple of monkeys sitting around going, I like baseball. Do you like baseball? I like baseball. Baseball is great. Yeah, I think baseball is great. But the reality is there are so many things to admire about this show, and the fact that the primary means of storytelling, even in dialogue, is show don't tell, really is a big reason why. I can't state strongly enough how important that is and how well this show does it.
Yeah, I guess one last thing I really enjoyed was Marty points out that Russ has a cross in his apartment, and Russ goes on to explain, it's like, I'm not religious. I just like to sit there and contemplate about a guy that's, willing to kill himself. Contemplating all the evil that goes on in the world. And it's just a subtle hint to the psyche of Russ. And as we go through this series, as he develops, it's a big part of the show. It really is, I think, honestly, the Russ's philosophical journey, his philosophical outlook. It's not the part. It's not the entirety of the show, but I do truly believe it's one thing that really grabbed me. It's also, I think, a huge driving force in the relationship and the direction that the show takes. But
it absolutely is. It absolutely is. You're 100% correct. I think the core is the relationship between the two, and I think the murder mystery is a secondary core piece of this. But their personalities, and particularly the character arcs for each of them, the growth that they both go through, is the true story. So you're right. Now, in this episode, we really talked a lot of overview stuff, and we did get into the first episode a bit, but I think in the future episodes, as we go through episode 2 and 3 in the next go round, we'll be talking more details of the actual episodes and diving into the moments and so forth. And then not as much of the highbrow philosophical aspects of it. I don't think we kind of got that out of the way here in the first episode with our overview. So I'm looking forward to watching episodes 2 and 3. And you and I will be back to dissect them and go into them ad nauseum.
I can't promise that I'm not going to go on tangents about that type of stuff. It's my temper.
We're both pretty guilty where that charge is concerned. That's for sure.
yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. You got a good introduction to just kind of how the series came about, and the very first episode, the major players and the major themes. And stay tuned, because episodes 2 and 3 are going to be a lot of fun.
Looking forward to it.